Right.
Oh yeah, this is awesome.
I just not to make you like nervous or never mind, too late. So I started off saying there's an interesting progression that I feel like existentialism is slightly out of order in terms of time, but it makes a lot of sense in terms of logical progression. And I had people vote on it, so the people that voted wanted to talk about existentialism. But the logical progression part being going from our first discussion of epistemology, which is how we know things, which kind of gets to, it breaks down at some point. Like there must be there are difficulties coming up with what the words are referencing and how we actually know that. And then we move to the postmodern and focus on language. And so all that we can know is our language. And then does language even make any sense? And what games are we playing with our language? And do they actually coordinate with each other? From that, it seems like that's also where the real existential question comes in, which is is there a reason to give reason primacy here? Is there a reason to not be ruled by the passions? And if there is a reason, for that, or if there's a purpose or something else, then it's not going to be logical. It's not going to be something that we arrive at from as Kierkegaard would say, be a leap of faith. It'd be something that you can't actually rationalize yourself into. You just have to do it. So that was my starting. I kind of started saying that there. I don't know if you wanted to...
Yeah, what you're saying is that there is no set of logical propositions, the final one in the sequence of which is therefore irrationality makes sense.
Kind of.
It just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
There's no path from using reason to non-reason. Okay.
Or there's no path. Reason is our ability to reason is so finite and flawed that that you might as well give up on it in the first place and just go with passions. Or there's no reason to act ethically. I would say is what Kierkegaard is kind of saying. You can't make a reason for it. Not that doesn't mean that there's not a purpose or a meaning or a value or even a Nietzschean aesthetic beauty of some kind. But the point being that you can't reason your way there.
So how do you get there?
Well, so I'm just laying the groundwork for it. That's the question for existentialism generally, right? So I'm giving the progression here. Unless you want to jump in already.
No, you keep going. But
okay, so the problem also in talking about existentialism in a way that because we've been talking about thinkers, specific thinkers, and kind of going through this person led to that person, this responding, and existentialism isn't really like that. It doesn't have that same kind of progression. You guys see you already, or but I see part of it is I contend that they weren't necessarily talking to each other. Like Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was vaguely aware of Dostoevsky, but they're not reading each other at the same time. Sometimes this is language is used, but the other thing is I feel like
unless you're talking about the French, but go ahead.
Yeah, some of this is the zeitgeist though, that it was already in the mood of the intellectual process, and so it kind of came out. And I think that's in that the fact that we were branching into this is reason even the point question is also what got into the postmodern kind of thing. Like we're just bringing our own language games anyway, and so it's kind of all up for interpretation, up for grabs. So that's the groundwork. But then there's an interesting set of questions because there's where does existentialism start? As a question or as a movement or something. And Jean-Paul Sartre gave his name, so we'll mention him at some point.
You're willing to concede that now?
He made the coinage, but
yes.
I was going to go back to everybody was referencing Søren Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard also made several different terms in Danish, which nobody used, which is why he didn't name it. But anyway, Søren Kierkegaard. So it's an interesting thing because when people were voting existentialism, I'm like, yeah, okay, existentialism. But also, he's my favorite philosopher. I've got a bust of him in my office. So it's kind of like, It's kind of like, oh, well, I get to talk to my favorite guy, so I'm not too disappointed. But also, I was thinking in terms of there's so much here and so many different directions, and doesn't have the same kind of coherence that even postmodern doesn't have some coherence.
Yeah.
You're still thinking you're.
Oh, I have so many things to say.
Okay, so let me finish my framing.
I'm there with you already.
Yeah. So listen, this is why I said you have to be here because I'm going to rabbit trail so bad that you have to snap me back. Okay. But the point, though, is Kierkegaard, although he's framing these ideas and starts off maybe the first person to be touching the zeitgeist, he's not the first existential writer. I mean, the first existential thing written, I think, is the book of Job.
Should we start by
Framing what it is.
framing what is existentialism?
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
would you like to pick that one up?
I would like a definition because I am the non-philosopher.
No, that's absolutely.
One
Yeah.
So
One of the
question here, define existentialism.
Pop for him. You want to get the? Oh. Yeah. That's like I can get up, but I have to go through the.
I'll get the microphone this time, okay?
Yeah. And video.
In video.
You're on video.
Uh-oh.
Well, theoretically, you just.
I think I gotta go. I'll see how that is.
Okay, good. It went to screensaver, but it was still recording, so good. But we were just going to define existentialism after I confused the heck out of everyone. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
You made it just in time for the actual definition.
But the problem is there isn't one. So this is actually why I didn't start that way. Existentialism is more a mood and an approach. So the question is about existence. That's where the root of the word comes
Well, I was
from.
going to say, if we were going to define it, though,
Okay.
How would we define it? Yes.
I would define it
Go for it.
as
Take over.
A, it's a focus on the individual experience. Suffering leads to a higher faith.
Or no fact.
Or,
neither.
yeah, it can go one of two ways.
Kierkegaard.
One will always intrinsically suffer, and that will lead you to faith, or it will lead you to the Nietzschean nihilism. There is a focus on life being absurd, and absurd doesn't mean like, circus. It means just like something
Motion sensors catching on.
something that you can't understand. Yeah.
Okay.
You're starting to answer.
Yeah.
No, individualism really can be said to begin with Cartesianism. It's an Enlightenment idea. The emphasis on the individual well precedes existentialism.
Oh my gosh. So are you sure? Do you know Alexander Dugin?
No,
He's been called Putin's philosopher.
Who's?
Putin.
Vladimir Putin. Heard of him.
And so of the Eurasian philosophy and movement, which is currently in Russia, Dugin is one of the biggest critics of what you would say modern liberalism. He wants to come up with some kind of blend of totalitarianism, communism, and dictatorial, whatever. Anyway,
It's the mood of the age.
yes, but his argument though is that from Descartes, it will actually from the Enlightenment generally, placing the center of meaning inside the individual must necessarily result in 72 genders and whatever, if you want to be your cat, you're a cat.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I think it's an interesting framing from him, because then he's like, since everybody's going nuts, let's go back to fascism or whatever. And so,
It's true. But the thing is, individualism, it leads there, but it took a couple hundred years.
yeah, and also happily there, I don't think.
Well, partly because, as Michael Polanyi pointed out, the Western Enlightenment philosophy lived on the sputtering flame, I love that, of the Christian worldview, the Christian consensus that preceded it. When that sputtered out at the end of the 19th century, it was left with nothing but cold, stark reason. Now, when you get to absurdist thinking, which is like 1920s, 1930s, spoken like a literary scholar, by the way. I mean, you're going to Sartre and Camus.
Yeah.
But
But I don't think that's necessarily just them. Obviously they wrote about Sisyphus, and so I think we can trace that well back, to where they got their roots.
you went all the way back to pre-Plato then.
Yeah,
yeah.
because that's where they got their.
It is partial.
Yeah. Well, pre-Plato, they got to skepticism.
Yeah.
As you know, the pre-Socratics. Skepticism. It is impossible to know anything for sure.
Yeah.
We say all truth is relative, but the same thing. And Plato was trying to resolve that by coming up with the unchangeable forms, the ideas, which are the basis of certainty of knowledge. And therefore knowledge is located in the mind, not in the external world, which
And then Aristotle's like, yeah, but your intellectual ideas never actually worked out perfectly in the real world. So let's start with the real world, but we can actually test and empirically judge you. Because I'm always going to argue for Aristotle.
Well, Descartes brackets out Aristotle.
Yeah.
Which starts us down the wrong path, but sort of. But a lot of good came out of it. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt what I was going to say, but if you were saying too late, I mean, we also have the aspects of, okay, free will and just basic radical personal responsibility, and I know a lot of it is
And all of that goes back to Descartes and to the early Enlightenment.
But if we're thinking things like free will, I mean, a lot of that can be...
Let me see, I may have to rein y'all in this stuff. Oh my gosh. Let me go back. This is why I wanted to start with Job. Because the thing that
I feel like we can find
the first book of existential literature is the book of Job.
Okay.
And also, I think that's a perfect. So this is how I want to frame this, because I feel like I said, I think we're talking about mood more than definitions. And if you get too much stuck in existentialist definitions, you're really talking about what they're doing rather than like what they would define, right? So it's not really platonic in definition. It's more like activity or like approach.
Well, what is the big slogan, the bumper sticker of
Sartre.
existentialism?
From Sartre?
Well, I think it precedes Sartre, but do you know what I was going to say?
Existence essence.
Existence precedes essence. Yes, existence precedes essence. Now, from the pre-Socratic stuff.
That's a large.
And it's also
statement.
Large,
Can you?
but it's a huge.
Can you break that down?
Yes, I can. And this is what makes existentialism.
He was an atheist.
Oh, yeah, he's avidly. Yeah.
This is what makes existentialism. Traditionally, from the pre-Socratics all the way through Christianity and a whole lot of other religious philosophies too, down to Friedrich Nietzsche, which is where existentialism, I want to say, begins. Essence precedes existence. What do we essence precedes existence? Okay, there is, pardon the Platonism here, but there's the idea of treeness, what a tree is, before any tree ever exists. That tree conforms, that's a Christian idea.
No,
God
it's
created
an idea that got taken wrongly by Christians, so I completely reject that. Go ahead.
Completely reject it. Okay, well, but go ahead anyway. Thank you. I have a right to be wrong. But the idea of a tree existed in the mind of God before God created the first tree. Okay? And
or something.
God didn't create trees to find out what they might look like. Which is why I'm not understood. But
also, you're putting God inside time, which is a problem, but really way off.
It is really weird, I know. But the essence of treeness existed before the first tree. The essence of what it means to be a human being existed before Adam and Eve were created. We all conform, rightly until the world goes crazy into existentialism, we all conform, or try more or less to conform to the ideal of what we're supposed to be. For the Enlightenment, the idea was we all should be rational. Universal education partly comes out of the idea that we need to train people so they can think and be aware of the world, because man is basically good and basically rational. But Christianity, we are basically created in the image of God. When the fall comes, that image is warped, and we want to get back to it. In every philosophy prior to Nietzsche, there was the idea, what is the full circle? What is the meta-narrative, to use a postmodern term? The overarching story to which we all conform, or to which we all ought to conform. Boom, along comes Nietzsche.
Or Kierkegaard.
What?
Or Dostoevsky.
And suddenly, no, you are, to borrow from Buddhism, a locus of consciousness. You're aware of your selfhood, you're aware of your existence, and you, in a sense, create your essence out of that by the exercise of your will. Now, you go from Nietzsche, I think you draw a straight line from Nietzsche to Heidegger, right?
Well,
and Heidegger says we project ourselves into this world.
Ruinous, yeah.
We don't allow all of these
Heidegger
other
read a whole lot of
people
Kierkegaard, by the way.
What?
Heidegger read a whole lot of Kierkegaard, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, he goes the same direction, I know.
Yeah. So, but here, I really want to go back to Jobe because I think I encompass a whole lot of what you're trying to do, and that's why I wanted to frame it as the beginning, possibly the first book of the Bible written Job.
Yeah.
And,
by the way, you're right too, because there's this whole other strain of existentialism.
Oh yeah,
I think
the literary version.
Yeah.
Literary version.
Which is more experience oriented.
Right, but see, if we talk about existentialism, I want to make sure that we demonstrate that the Bible claimed it first. That's my whole point with going there. Like all of this, the Bible did it first, and Job started right off with that. And then all of Ecclesiastes is essentially the same kind of conceptualization that Nietzsche had, except it's like, okay, it's going to suck either way. I guess I'll have to go with God. Mm-hmm. Like that's essentially his, and that's all.
Because of his conclusion, yeah.
That's all existentialism.
Life is meaningless. It's absurd.
Yeah, but the interesting thing that you're probably not going to have read. Have you ever heard of The Answer to Job by Carl Jung?
No, I haven't.
One of the most powerful books against Christianity that I've ever read.
Yeah.
And Jung basically goes into Job, and as the story of Job goes, I'll say for you guys all already know, but for an audience, if I happen to have one, the book of Job is basically you've got a righteous man who is persecuted for his righteousness. Satan wants to test him and see, like, if you didn't give him all this stuff, then you'd be fine. So, God's like, okay, you can go ahead and poke him. So, Satan pokes him and hurts him as much as he can, kills his family, like gives him boils, like just makes his life miserable. Mm-hmm. And Job doesn't reject God. And then at the last moment, God shows up, Deus Ex Machina, and rather than resolving the problem and fixing anything, he's like, what are you complaining about?
Yes.
And Jung's like, what kind of God is that? You just like, you come in at the last, you don't fix anything, you don't make justice, you just make the guy more miserable and fuss about how much he doesn't understand the world. And so he's basically calling God a brat. And so let me finish. I want to make sure I finish the thought.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I finish the thought. So he's basically like God just be bratty and like you're not doing what I want, so just let him. Or he was doing what he wanted to, but it's like there's a catch-22 in terms of like how is Job supposed to respond here? The thing that because I struggled with this for a significant amount of time, a couple of months after having read that book, which is a long time for me to struggle with something, just FYI. But my interesting thing was I was thinking of Joseph Campbell, who's another person that I don't know if you've read, but Monolith, but anyway, doesn't matter. But the idea, like Jung and Campbell both had like this stage conceptualization of human growth, like going from stage 1 to stage, working with this. And each one of those has a guardian. Like in terms of mythology, there's a guardian for the next stage. The thing is, in this picture of Job, God isn't coming into Deus Ex Machina to solve the problem. God is the last test. The thing that is the test is our relationship to, and if there is no God, it doesn't even matter because the story can work if this is all metaphor. Right. Our relation to being finite beings in a world that we have no ability to control and irrationality can happen. Nothing is within our control. And as I would say, Solomon responds, so that, if everything's going to suck, it's still better to serve God. But the point, though, is like we are all these finite beings confronted by this overwhelming, overpowering universe that we can never have any chance of getting anything out of if it turns against us, let's say. So and I think that is the foundational existential theme with that. I think the book of Job actually kind of responds to a lot of this.
Later, Job is a conception of good and evil. Part of Job's whole contention is that what's happened to me is evil, objectively evil, and objectively unjust because I'm a righteous man. I deserve better than this. Mm-hmm. So lying behind that, there's some kind of it's not just, things happen and just, it's better to serve God than not to because it makes me happier or something. There's an actual goodness lying behind the universe. That's God's whole point at the end of the book. He doesn't solve Job's problem for him, obviously, but he does expand Job's frame of reference. Mm-hmm. Well, where are you, when the deer calves? Where are you when...
Well, here's Leviathan. What can you do to stop it?
Yeah. The point is there's a whole lot of things that go on in the world that are much bigger than you. And there are bigger issues and a whole lot more goodness in the world. In spite of all that's happened to you.
the framing in the way in which I would say it's very specifically existential is that you're never going to know all of these things, and you can die without knowing it, but you're still, I would say, this is why I like Ecclesiastes as the second book, because you're still existentially responsible for following God's law, even if you don't understand it.
Right.
And
But there's a certain goodness in God. There's an absolute goodness.
Sure.
In fact, the challenge that Job throws down to, the book of Job throws down to us is, no matter how many bad things ever happen to you, and you may lose a child, you may lose, loved ones, your career may go to pot, you know, all kinds of bad things can happen to you. Your 401k can tank when it's not Sovereign Bank, but whatever, Bank of the James or Bank of America or whatever. Yeah. The whole thing can go to pot. Are you willing to trust that God is good and that all shall be well and all shall be well?
And can that ever be argued to logically, or is it a leap of faith?
Yes.
I don't know which one that is. Yes, no, okay.
Yes, ultimately, the Bible reveals that God is good, the world is bad. God doesn't fix it right now. But we have the eschatological hope that God will fix it in the end. Mm-hmm. And are you willing to repent of your sense of self-importance, which Job certainly had, your sense of the way things ought to be, and trust the goodness of God, even though you don't see it? And it's not just leap of faith, because it's not my own creation. It's God reveals himself as good amid a world that's filled with evil, and he challenges me to trust his goodness even when my career goes south, even when my 401k collapses, even when my mother dies, even when I'm 500 miles from home and no way to get home.
You told us the story last week.
Yeah. But I've lived that.
Right, exactly. You told the story last week.
Did I?
Yeah.
Okay. Every bit of that, can you still trust that God is good, or do you give up and decide that God is evil or non-existence? It is more than just leap of faith.
That's curious, but see, I don't.
No, I believe that's faith.
That is the definition of faith. That is the definition.
Is it leap in the dark, or is it based on
empiricism? Is that where you're going to go?
It's
no, based on God's revelation. Go ahead. What?
But that's
I mean, I feel like that you're defining faith right now.
Yes, you are.
Mm-hmm. I'm defining in terms of God has revealed himself.
Mm-hmm. But I think what he's doing is saying that the faith that's projected there, it is a leap of faith, but it's not solely based on only belief. It's not blind.
It doesn't.
It's not. Yeah. It's not blind. You're looking and saying there are logical reasons for me taking this next leap.
God has proved himself before, therefore I can confidently believe in him again to do
this. And so to bring us back to philosophy, because you guys are being very existential, which is great. but in terms of philosophic, like Hume's going to say, just because something happened before doesn't going to happen again, and just because you have X, Y, Z in terms of your experimental evidence doesn't mean that that's actually reality. I mean, this is the whole why I said it works really well in terms of we went to the extent of human reason. And you can't get there. And then you go the extent of human language capacity, and you can't even have a conversation together. And at some point, you're stuck with just believing, just putting faith. And that's what Kierkegaard says. So let me break into the Kierkegaard versus Nietzsche, because this is where you get the two paths. Yeah. And this is the two themes in existentialism are going to be Kierkegaard and those who choose God and choose to make that leap of faith. He calls it a leap. That's the Kierkegaardian phrase. That leap of faith. And those who reject it all and say there is no hope. There's nothing in the universe. It's
because they were so devoted to personal responsibility and this radical sense of free will, but that's not ethical. Like Sartre and Camus.
Oh, right.
But they really were just still stuck in the aesthetic, I think.
Was your boy Christian?
What?
Was your boy Christian?
What boy?
The guy? Kafka.
Oh, no, he's Jewish.
Oh, okay.
But how
you would need to be more specific.
All of your usernames have his name in it, so I figured that would be.
Wait a minute. Camus, Sartre are being irrational when they propound this ethic? Is that what you're saying?
I feel that irrational is the wrong term.
No, I think they were being, I think pleasure seek. Like, if you are like just seeking like knowledge, and I feel like that can be aesthetic.
Oh yeah,
Aesthetic,
for sure.
Purely aesthetic.
Because also, like, I've always thought of like knowledge is power, right? You've always heard that phrase. And if people are just seeking knowledge, they're just seeking power in a sense. Because I see this in my own life sometimes where like I want to know something because I feel like if I can understand it, I can have better control and mastery over that thing or that item. And so it's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I think it's more knowledge for the sake of control.
What a perfect segue to Nietzsche, who has a frame, will to power.
Yeah.
So he says everything that's an expression of like what you're trying to accomplish is a will to power, to have some kind of control over the universe, which I would say is the opposite of like a Job or a Christ giving himself up. Like, I don't want this thing, but it's going to happen anyway. Like, take this cut from me. But let me finish off the Kierkegaard thought for a bit. So I'm going to derail, but that's like, keep that in mind. We'll come back because I definitely want to like get on Nietzsche a little bit more. But so Kierkegaard writes he wants to make sure he steelmans all his arguments. So he doesn't want to write something and then reject it or whatever. So that's why he writes using pseudonyms. So he can have whole characters that are atheists write a book and have those characters make the strongest argument for their position possible, even though he doesn't necessarily believe it. Or he may have tweets. It's not exactly his, but the point is one of his Johannes Climacus was one of his characters who was an atheist, looking at and understanding the real challenge of Christianity. This is the conceptualization, but not able to accept it. So he's not taking the stance of being like anti-God or whatever. He's kind of taking the more like the point is, he writes, the book is Fear and Trembling, and he goes back and is looking specifically at the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And one of the primary themes in existentialism is individuality, your individual experience, and our individual stance before God in judgment, too. Like, we're going to be judged as individuals rather than a group, although I think that we've pushed that a little too far in the culture.
For sure.
Still, as we were talking about earlier in Sunday school.
Sunday school.
Yeah.
Sunday school.
Exactly.
But the Abraham and Isaac thing is so interesting because basically Kierkegaard's like, okay, so this guy is going up the hill to kill his son, right? And I would say, I'll like, he doesn't say it, but I'm still good enough. The point is, like, if you ran into Abraham at this point, you're going to have a moral obligation to stop him. Not only, you may actually have a moral obligation to kill him to keep him from killing his son, or you may have you need to at least lock him up in an insane asylum because he's nuts, he thinks he's talking to God, he's going to kill somebody. Right? And so the question is, this is a person that's having to do something entirely outside of the social norms and outside of the expectation of the church and outside of the expectation of normal morality because God told him to do it. And it's not a simplistic question. And this is the thing that he's saying is the leap of faith, essentially, is this individuality, which is a problem because then that's exactly how the church has been corrupted in the idea of like, let's just make a smorgasbord, rather than looking for specifically what actual God is telling me. I'll live for my version of God, but that thing is telling me.
It's so comfortable to think that God operates within our social cultures, but like the matter of the fact is God's never really operated inside our culture. Like, yes, he's come as a man, right? He's come as Jesus, and like Paul says, like to the Gentiles, I give the Gentiles, and the barbarians, I become barbarians. But like, when God asks you to do something, he's not concerned about what other people are going to think. He's just like, are you going to do it or are you not?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Fred looks uncomfortable.
Yeah. He knows me too well. But doesn't God always act within our culture, even when he challenges us to move out of it? God doesn't act blindly as
no, that's not what I'm saying.
Not unaware, but he may call us out of our cultural comfort zone because we're too comfortable in it.
I think what he's saying more is like God does not.
He's not restricted.
He's not restricted by our social.
No, he's not.
Structures, and that's what we would like to
and
believe.
It's
is
the
that
people
who follow.
It's the people that when people have that mindset of like, oh, God wouldn't ask me to do this because that's not culturally acceptable. I don't think you have the correct word. Like,
or Job's friends, God wouldn't be doing this if X, Y, Z, right? Like just this pre-existing expectation, and then we have to, as individuals, confront the actuality of God.
God speaks to us within our theological presuppositions, but sometimes outside of them. Have you ever run into vital, robust spiritual life in a place where maybe they were not Southern Baptist or something? I hope you have. It can be, if you've been too sheltered, a startling revelation. I had a friend one time whose faith got completely messed up when he discovered that God was actually at work among the Lutherans, you know?
Yeah.
People who did not share his theological presuppositions actually knew Christ. Oh, amazing, you know? But, I mean, sometimes God does that, and we have to learn to be open to that possibility. But he doesn't do it blindly.
Oh, no.
In fact, I'm invoking Leslie Newbegin here.
Okay.
If God were to try to communicate with us outside of our own cultural setting, we wouldn't recognize it as the voice of God at all.
Yeah.
If he communicates totally within our cultural setting, it becomes not the voice of God, just the culture speaking loudly or something. God speaks to us to challenge us beyond, I used to call it beyond respectability. We're all respectable people, saved, lost, Christian, non-Christian, existentialist, whatever. We're mostly respectable people. God calls us beyond respectability to something more. The Sermon on the Mount is built on this idea. You know, you've heard it said, but I say to you. Or, this is the way it's been done, the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees.
Yeah.
I want you to exceed it. And here's how you do it. That's God. Always speaking beyond our culture, but he speaks, I guess the best way is with reference to where we are.
He's got one foot in the culture, one foot out of the culture.
Yeah.
In a sense.
So,
Fred, you've read The Grand Inquisitor by...
Yes.
So that's sort of what this... by Dostoevsky.
Okay.
of course.
Of course.
I figured it was Dostoevsky just by the name. I was like, it's probably
Well, I was assuming just really based off of who she is.
What's your point with the Grand Inquisitor?
Well,
Let's hear it. Let's hear this.
Well, the story is basically about suppose Jesus were to come back and face judgment, like how would he be treated? And the whole idea is that he is considered a threat to the church.
Yes.
So the conversation is just making me think.
We could do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But how often, I want to grind my little axe again here, but how often in our churches do we try to put Jesus into a box that we can control? Jesus thinks just like we think. What he would do is exactly what we're already doing. And anything or anyone who is different is a threat to us. And we must purify the church of any threat, purify the society of any threats.
Or anything that's outside of our expectations, which is again back to Job.
We expect Jesus to behave just like us, think just like us. If he were to come back today, he would blend right in, and
He didn't blend into society either. So. But at that point, we're shaping God in our image rather than the other way around.
Well, and that just goes back to the Pharisees and at the beginning of the New Testament. That's like how the Pharisees acted and how the Pharisees thought of themselves and how the Pharisees thought of everyone else. It's the exact same way, I think, and a lot of churches today think about the world and themselves. It's just like, I've got the right God and everyone else has got the wrong one.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the right God that I have, then you're wrong and you're going to hell probably.
Exactly.
I find it interesting what Fred was saying, where it's like our culture would still completely be different than, like Jesus would be completely different than him. It's funny to me that it's like Jesus would be closer to the guys standing around down at the vape shops downtown than to the blue collar workers or higher ups
I find that
in society. It's like he would be down there in downtown at the vape shop with those guys. I mean, that's kind of like our like the guys who do drugs, that kind of stuff. That's kind of our tax collectors almost in society.
Right.
That's where he would
Jesus
be
identifies
as
with
church.
the outsider, the marginalized, the nobodies.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
That's why the blue-haired folks are my favorite clients. Well, I'm saying, I mean, I probably don't agree with them in terms of whatever, but they're the people that need the most.
Who've been upset by
Injury
a fast-changing world, upset by
the poor and
life not meeting their expectations. Yeah, what?
I was saying like the poor
And the traumatized, yeah.
the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
Broken.
But I think we were kind of like diverging off. We were talking originally about the Abrahamic sacrifice and the stuff, and then or do we want to get back to that? Or we just kind of go off?
We're not even close to existentialism right now.
No, absolutely. Like,
That's what I thought. I wasn't sure.
The problem is like existentialism is going to not become the fight categorization. It's more like discussions of various themes. And so what I did is I wrote down some themes here, but yeah, it's going to be the like subject authenticity, individuality. We've been talking about that, and thrownness. Like people didn't choose to exist, and like we're here, and like we have to figure out what to do with it. And then the passions, which is the reasons we've been talking about all of that. I was just citing it. Like I don't remember if there was anything else I was going to say. Like the Kierkegaardian thing about the night of faith being somebody that God is speaking to directly, and like it's his. And this is what I say. Like you can't judge another man's servant, or another person's servant, right? So like if it's hard to find a balance between that and the fruit testing that we're supposed to do.
Right.
So I don't want to judge someone, God's servant here, but also, you have to try to look for the fruits of the Spirit.
I think
so there's some challenges there.
That's where
I mean,
I would argue that having a closed canon is part of what helps with that. Whereas with Abraham, there was no canonical scripture at that point. He was speaking
Did
to
you
God.
just condemn the Catholics?
Sorry. But now that
He's condemned the word of faith.
Don't we've talked about that.
now that we
No,
have
yeah.
canonical scripture, we can use that to say, now is what they're saying in line with.
Yeah.
It may not be in line with what we think is right, but is it in line with scripture?
Right.
It may make us uncomfortable, but is it in line with scripture?
And then along with that, I think sometimes we kind of take that and then run with it a little bit, kind of what you're saying with the spiritual fruit testing. Like, we want to look for those spiritual fruits, and I think those are kind of general across the board. If you are a Christian, you're going to exude some of those fruits. It's when we go to, all right, so you got the spiritual fruits. So how about your theology? Is that still like where does that lie? If it's not like here,
and so that's so existential in theme because that is going back to the rejection or the criticism of reason. Because theology must necessarily be an activity of trying to come up with a coherent understanding of what is perfection, rather than with the recognition that there's that
Theology is traditionally understood. Must be that.
Yeah.
I'm going to correct you there.
Boy, I can't wait to get into this conversation. I think that we've.
I don't know. Yeah.
Have we had part of this conversation?
Little bits and pieces of it, yeah.
But I feel like that's going to be a different.
That needs to be a completely different.
that'll be a topic for next time.
Yeah.
Well, let me go steal man some Nietzsche then, because he's like.
He wanted to talk about Nietzsche.
Yeah, because we need to give the devil his due, somewhat literally. I don't know if you're going to have any input, but like I don't know if I read through all of Nietzsche in college because being the rebellious grunge kind of person, I was like so cool, man, and still Christian at the time, but Nietzsche has just goes full canons on Christianity generally. Saying that the only thing that this has ever really accomplished is a slave morality, is what he says. And it's like the slaves eventually said, you know what, we're never going to be as smart, as rich, as powerful as all the elites, so we should just say, the way we are is better than you. And so then they have convinced themselves that being poor in spirit and meek and whatever is actually a virtue, just so they can feel better about themselves. And that's just self-deception, and you guys are being ridiculous, and everything is really will to power. And since you're so, this is a really, Nietzsche's one of the few people that is is really the most brilliant people ever. But his comment is so true that essentially if you can't attack somebody else or hurt somebody else, you will hurt yourself. And this is absolutely something I can tell you in terms of a therapeutic process. If somebody's got an abusive parent or whatever, they're angry at the parent, but they can't do anything to the parent, they're going to start cutting themselves. And it's really a very similar process in there. And so Nietzsche is basically saying that was the entire formation of Christianity, was a way for the slaves and the people who will never be strong or whatever to pretend that they're better than everybody else. And so his entire process is like, we need to love fate and love the irrationality or the lack of anything, and then force ourselves to take responsibility for our condition, to become stronger, to become the Ubermensch, if you've heard that term, kind of, if we can. Most people can't. Most people are just going to be, and this is the thing that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche have in common, is this rejection of the herd morality, or the herd approach. Like, Kierkegaard's rejecting the formalized church of his day and saying, you guys have like absolutely stolen the faith out of your faith. And Nietzsche's saying, you guys are just going along with this because that's what everybody's doing and you're all idiots.
Well, both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are reacting against a stale, moribund, middle-class, respectable kind of Christianity, where there is no spiritual life. You come to church, you recite the creeds, you take the Lord's Supper, and you go home, and life goes on as if nothing had happened.
Yeah.
And I read the Antichrist, and I just want to jump up on the table and jump up and down and shout, yes, 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 yes. Because what Nietzsche's reacting against is this moribund kind of Christianity. And Kierkegaard, on the other hand, sees the same thing and says, wait, what we find in the New Testament is a lot more likely than this stuff. I know I'm oversimplifying, but
sure. Well, he's also saying that there's a broad is the way, narrow is the gate kind of thing, and that's true for people in the formal church too. Like a lot of y'all aren't making it.
Yeah.
I was just going to agree, because Nietzsche was so critical of not just Christianity, but organized religion and the church, and Kierkegaard was so much the same way that he refused last rites. He was he got in so much trouble being critical of the church. I mean, he was hated around Denmark or Copenhagen, whatever. I don't know if it was whatever, but just because he was so critical of organized religion and the people, like you were saying, who were just
going through the motions, but nothing of the lively faith that you find in Paul and we find in the book of Acts. Nothing even close to that. With Precious, did he go too far? Did he reject too much?
So are we saying that Kierkegaard is kind of like the Paul of his day? Is that what we're saying? Where he's like, or no?
That would be a little bit extreme.
I'm still new to the whole like philosophers and like the different things. I'm trying to if I'm getting this correctly, Kierkegaard sees the organized church and he sees it's kind of like pretty lukewarm, and he's like, guys, we got to do something.
Yeah.
And then Nietzsche is seeing the lukewarm church and it's like, they're
also the whole society. Nietzsche is like also broadening its into the whole society too.
Okay. So Kierkegaard is more of like, we can do better, and then Nietzsche is like,
Well, Kierkegaard would have said, you can do better, because he's all about the individual, right? And the more you're hiding within the herd, the more you're being inauthentic.
Maybe you can do better. Some people can do better.
So I kind of wonder, was this really the start of the American man? Was this the start of the American dream, where you have this individual, pick yourself up by your own britches and
so
your own? That started much earlier.
Going back to
is this
let me jump. But going back to what I said about Dugin and like when you have John Locke was the original like formation for American philosophy, you have that placement of value in the individual rights and individual whatever, and that's what Dugin was saying. Like that thing's always going to lead to this buffet version of reality where we just take what you want and leave the rest. And with no grounding. So to some extent, if you're going to pick something that starts the American process, I would say it's that centering of full I don't even know the word there, full responsibility into the individual rather than partial. I mean, like there is a share between the body of Christ, the church community, versus the individual. But there has to be, the individual needs to be able to act as themselves and for themselves, and you're going to have to face judgment for yourself, not for the community. Yeah. So there's a tension there, it's a back and forth, but
it goes back to paradoxes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, yeah, because like it's either on one end it's like all law, it's all your responsibility, or on the other end it's like all grace, it's all God's responsibility. And the truth of the matter is like it's both. Like you need to, like God's grace is there and He will carry you through, but you are also responsible at the same time to follow Him.
Work out
your faith.
And I feel like salvation
with fear and trembling. That's right.
Well, I feel like that's something that we don't stress enough, because that's something I know I was confused about throughout middle school and high school, was the fact that
I'm still confused.
God does. Well, no, yeah. So I feel like we don't bring up that it is a confusing topic that we should be discussing, because I was confused, about like you becoming a new Christian, and all of a sudden I'm still having all of these problems. Why is this happening to me?
I thought I'd be like perfect one time.
Yeah. I mean, that is almost the expectation, which if you're not taught correctly. And I'm not saying that everybody around me failed to teach me correctly. I think it's just in the church in general, we don't say,
hey, so I was bashing Catholics. He's just bashing the church.
I'm just bashing the church.
I'm sorry. I think it's because the church doesn't focus on sin enough. I think it's more of like, oh, we don't want to talk about sin because that's taboo. Let's talk about.
I think some of that's strong manning, though. I think some of that's strong manning the position, because here's the reality that I think I would say mature Christians end up running into is. Like things like you don't want to be a stumbling block, right?
Right.
So I'm not going to bring up very difficult questions that I don't have a really good answer to, because I don't want to create a problem for you and so then I'm taking some responsibility for it. But then also maybe the people who can don't talk about it. I feel like this is part of why I wanted to create this group. Like those people who have actually wrestled with these problems, at least I have my answers for it, and I feel like they're sufficient. But I mean, you don't like them, but that's fair. but at least somebody's taught. I want somebody to at least talk about it.
Yeah. Address the elephant in the room that there is a confusion instead of not talking about it and hope everyone figures it out on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, because then you get a lot of division, because you've got all of these different people, everybody's going to figure it out in a slightly different manner, which I think is going to happen anyways. But if you have at least a community of some kind that teaches you how to figure it out, then at least you'll figure it out biblically. Mm-hmm. Like, because I've seen a lot of people who, they figure it out, but they don't figure it out biblically, and that leads them away from the church.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's
they quote unquote figure it out.
Well, they yeah. The world would see it as they figure it out for themselves, or it's almost a universalist view. You figure it out for yourself.
But again, that goes back to individualism. Like, I have to figure it out for myself. Whereas like here, because we are a community in the body of Christ, we are figuring it out together.
Mm-hmm. That is a big difference. That is one of the things the church has to offer Western secularism, which really begins with the primacy of the individual. Going back to Descartes. So, I mean, it's all footnotes to Descartes, you might say, including Nietzsche and so forth. But, if you're going to figure it out, and the American church doesn't emphasize this, and we darn well on it, truth is hammered out. Truth is hammered out, believed, understood, and lived out, I think, biblically, in community with one another. It's reciprocal. We bring our gifts to the table, and we all benefit and we all share from one another. The Bible should be read in small groups, not individually and alone. Yeah. I would almost say there. Well, I didn't say it, but we have this idea, this me and Jesus, we got our thing going, and I have my Bible, I have the Holy Spirit, I don't need any more than this.
Well,
oh, yes, you do. Jesus said, I'll build my church. Not, I will make each one of you a blessing in your own heart to yourself. You never said that.
Yeah, and I would add on to yours, where you said we should read it as a group, not necessarily as an individual. Mm-hmm. I think we should read it as an individual, but then we should present it to at least one or two other people.
Yeah.
So that we have that discussion in the group. Because then, number one, you'll build each other up. Mm-hmm. If I'm reading one thing, Joel's reading another, and then we're having another person in the conversation who's reading something else. Then we're all learning from those three different parts of the Bible. So that's helpful.
Yes.
But also keeps it accountable. It makes sure that we don't have any weird,
There's no
heresies or anything.
individual echo chamber where I'm reading
Yeah.
something and I go, oh, this is right to me, and then I don't tell anyone about it, and then I just like go ahead and believe it, and then that kind of like exponentially gets.
So I think we should have that, just as a clarification, I think we should have that, me and Jesus in the Bible.
And some friends.
And some friends. But we should have that Bible time personally to learn more about the Bible, and then we should bring it and discuss it with other people.
Yeah.
As a guy that made his entire theory of everything in complete isolation, I actually agree. So, yeah,
Let's put that before a panel.
What?
So we'll put that before a panel.
Sure.
Can we start a committee? We're Baptist after all.
Committee. Did you have something?
I got a question.
Sure.
To what extent then, I mean, especially if you emphasize the literature side of it, you might want to answer yes to this. To what extent then is existentialism a continuation of 19th century romanticism, a reaction against Enlightenment rationalism, which began really with poets, Wordsworth and Schiller and those people, that Beethoven and then in other areas of literature, and eventually works its way into philosophy as existentialism, which is just that kind of anti-rationalism, anti-primacy of reason on steroids. Am I right?
Yes.
Oh,
Good answer. let me before she is organizing her thoughts.
I mean, the answer is yes.
final word.
I was going to say the framing of anti-rationalism, I feel like is more postmodern.
But what I liked,
Yeah.
But what I liked about what you said was that started in literature
Yes.
as a reaction to the Enlightenment, and then trickled to philosophy, because I think that's very true.
So,
And it doesn't always work that way.
And
that's what I was thinking.
I was going to ask, how often does that happen?
It doesn't.
Like never.
It doesn't. And I think what's so important, especially because Nathan doesn't believe me.
That really makes it important.
And it makes it especially true. But that Dostoevsky did influence Nietzsche's philosophy. So it's absolutely true. And that Dostoevsky was just so important in shaping the existentialist movement, which Nathan also doesn't believe. So it was like, you can't talk about existentialism if you're not going to talk about Dostoevsky.
Well, I don't care about anything beyond Kierkegaard. He definitely
Yeah, I know.
Like,
You're like,
so it's like the rest of it, I don't care.
I was like, you're going to talk about literature. He's like, why would we talk about literature? It's like, right.
Well, uniquely in philosophy, though, existentialism, more than any other philosophy, engendered, bred, and was carried forward by literature. Kierkegaard, and then Camus, and so-called Sartre, and all of these absurdist playwriters, and Eugenia Ionesco, we've been talking about herd mentality here. I mean, it's as much a literary movement or a movement carried by literature as by philosophy in its pure form. Absolutely. You're right.
I think I would like to. I'm going to go out alone. I don't know much about this, but it sounds to me, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but like that existentialism, because it's so self or individual focused and so emotional and experiential, that's why it's easier to come out in art forms, because art is a mood and it comes from experience. You can't really make art from like. I mean, you could make art from science, but then again, like all art is like relative. All art is subjective, and I think that's why it was able to carry through literature and the arts and other music and other things like that.
So the two are equal suited to each other.
Yes, they synergize and complement each other.
Arguably, that's why it was found in the arts before it was found in philosophy. Because the arts has always bred existentialism, if you really look at it. And so that's why...
Apart from iconography, maybe.
Well,
But
because with philosophy, it's most of philosophy is logical thought, whether it be logical thought about emotions or logical thought about, like, Platonic, a logical thought. Like
Right.
But even if we're talking about... I'm sorry, go on.
No, you go.
Well, I was going to say, even if we're talking about the philosophers in the existential movement, if we look at how the style in which they wrote, it's a lot of an indirect method. Like Kierkegaard wrote, very ironically and with this, paradoxical method, and then Nietzsche is just like crazy and like fun to read and very stylistic.
Why I write such good books?
Yeah, exactly. Like literally, like the philosopher who uses the most exclamation marks out of anyone, which is why I love him. And then if we're talking about Camus and Sartre, like they will write fiction and express their philosophy via fiction.
Right.
So
Okay, they were doing it directly. Go ahead.
I might be derailing a little bit.
That's the whole thing.
I mean, I've got one thought that I want to completely derail, but that's after we're done with this because I want to specifically talk to her about it.
I was going to ask, I wonder how much psychology and just the different things that we talk about get into fiction without people realizing it. Like,
what a perfect question.
We've got a literary nut, two literary nuts, and a psychologist.
Like, it's one of those, like, I think that it's in there, and that's probably how most people are not going to sit down and read Nietzsche or an actual philosophy book, because most of them sit down and read a page and go, I have no idea what he's talking about. But if you take those ideas and get them into the culture, and then it morphs into writing and literature, that's where the normal people start to hear it and actually understand it through story.
Who was it I was just reading that talked about second-rate minds?
The what?
That talked about second-rate minds? Your guy. Who was it that I was just... T.S. Eliot.
Oh.
Yeah, just reading T.S. Eliot. He was talking about the value of second-rate minds. Like, first-rate minds will create something, but if they don't have second-rate minds, they can understand it and then, like, bring it down to the next level. Then it's never going to go anywhere. So you have to have, like... So he's like, the actual society is run based on the second-rate minds, which I think is anti-Nietzschean.
That's such a T.S. Eliot thing.
Really?
It's so T.S. Eliot.
Can I drop a thought? Just to... I don't think it begins and ends with existentialism, although existentialism has produced literature and even music, I think, more intentionally than any previous philosophy. But Francis Schaeffer pointed out and defended moderately well the idea that every age, the philosophy that's prevailing eventually affects the art, music, and literature of that age.
I would say
trickle down.
It does.
And I would say that as an author, if you guys don't know, you should. But as I'm writing stories, that's what I'm trying to do. Like, at first it wasn't intentional on my part, but then I was like, wait, I can do this. And I'm taking the way I see the world and the way I see truth and embedding it within a story so that I can communicate that truth to people who may not pick up a Bible, who may not pick up some theology book, but they'll read a random fiction novel and set in a fantasy world because it's fun, but they still get the same truths.
You do kind of what Madame L'Engle used to do, what C.S. Lewis did.
I'm trying.
Taking that worldview, that philosophy, and trying to express it literarily to.
So I would argue that
of the Bible. Yeah.
I would argue that every author does that with whatever worldview that they
I
have.
don't know if you can stop
I
it.
agree 100%.
Yeah. If you
And
have
not just
the worldview,
authors.
it's gonna come out
Yeah.
whether you write or
And not just authors, painters. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
We get, if you go back to the classical era, painters and musicians, Sir Isaac Newton gave us this clockwork mechanistic universe. Bach gives us the same thing in his music, fugues and three-part inventions and things like that. Along comes Enlightenment rationalism almost right along with it. And Mozart is giving us these very rational sonatas and symphonies and things where all of the music comes back to a certain point and follows a certain form, and it's all reasonable. The Romantic era comes along, and you've got Beethoven and Chopin and all of these people writing music where the emotions are first thing and nothing else matters but how you feel, which collapses under its own weight. And then existentialism comes along, anti-metaphysical, and you get the 20th century, what my wife calls dink-donk music. The music that's this kind of,
I see you, Kurt Cobain.
I was going to say, I feel like the 90s is like the perfect example of existential.
music.
Yeah, grunge.
Jazz or what? 90s pop.
Like 90s grunge.
Yeah, grunge rock.
It's like
Grunge rock.
you don't have to be good. You need to know 4 chords on an electric guitar.
Four.
Yeah.
That's a whole extra chord.
Yeah,
there's 3.
and you don't have to sing well. And
You just have to be
you just need to be
scream.
loud.
And actually, in terms of existentialism, that is primarily one of the themes that you would say is authenticity. And that was the thing that
It
was
just
for
needs to-
sale in
it
the
just needs
90s
to
was
resonate.
authenticity.
Yeah, it just needs to resonate.
Which I say that
Well,
existentialism. Yeah.
And if I may, because you were focusing more on the auditory arts.
Yeah, but the visual arts were the
And
same
we were
word.
also talking about the literary arts.
Yeah.
If you look at visual arts, even that reflects what the person is thinking, and here it comes out on the canvas. As a visual artist, that's what I think about while I'm painting.
Yeah.
But as I know, there's at least 2 people in here who like this author, and 1 person who hates him.
Okay.
You me who hates him. Victor Hugo.
No, I love
Les
it.
Miserables.
It's my second favorite novel.
Oh, okay.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, Les Mis. So you've read Les Mis. You know how he describes his settings, how very black and white he is. He has this amazing quality in Les Mis specifically to have this beautiful picture of Cosette and Marius, and then all of a sudden you're back in the Thénardier's grungy, awful place.
Right.
And so you have that kind of painting, but then I don't know if you've ever looked at his artwork. Victor Hugo did a lot of artwork. It is exactly the same. It's all black and white. It's pen, usually pen or charcoal, and you always have the lightness of the focal point, and then you have this dark, awful, like evil characters or like waves. There's one specific one I really like. I don't know the names or anything, but he's done a couple where it's a lighthouse, and the lighthouse is this beautiful light thing. And then around it is the waves and the rocks, and you can barely differentiate between the waves and the rocks because they're so dark. And so you can see his worldview and how he writes, and you can also see the same exact worldview in how he draws and what art he does.
Right.
So I would highly suggest
Very much
going
like
and looking it up.
I'm going to look him up this afternoon. I didn't know he did any art. I'm sure I can Google images of Victor Hugo.
Yeah, it comes right up. Yeah. I didn't actually know it until last week. My literature teacher, while we were going through Les Mis, mentioned it, and I was like, "Oh, I've got to go do that." And I did, and I was like, "Wow, that's really cool to see how his literature and his art match up."
Well, the same thing what I was saying earlier applies here. I mean, the 20th century gives us anti-metaphysics, full-blown existentialism. Life is absurd. All of this philosophy, and it gives us Jackson Pollock. Do you know Jackson Pollock?
Yeah. Who was that painting? What was that painting that maybe you would remember too? Eunice, when she did her presentation, it was the painting. I think it was in the.
She did Thomas Cole. That's
The
one
dance.
Thomas
Dance.
Cole. Oh my goodness.
Yes.
No, I love Thomas Cole. No, that's the wrong one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that.
The dance one?
The dance marathon is called Dance
Dance
Marathon.
Yes.
It was,
Wasn't that drawn around the same time that we're kind of talking about?
it was in the Great Depression as all that.
Yeah, which is I feel like it would also be around when existentialism.
Well, yeah, that'd be, but I don't feel like that's. I don't know. I feel like that's a social commentary,
True.
political piece.
True.
What are you talking about?
Dance Marathon.
Really
Evergreen.
Evergreen by who?
No, it's
Evergreen.
Dance Marathon.
Evergreen's the name of the author, or something.
No, Dance Marathon is the name of the piece.
Dance Marathon is the name of the piece, and I think the author's, the painter's name was Evergreen. Something like that. Like this, I was not even trying to remember that. But let me while you look up.
Completely
Two of you guys actually got into something that I wanted to go with as well. So in preparation for this, I listened through a lecture series on existentialism, kind of this picture of like how it presented like that. But there are several of the lectures were on entirely on various stories that, of course, you've mentioned and whatnot, and it would allow me to pinpoint my objections. You're like,
Y'all are gonna argue about this for hours.
but not really, because it's what I feel like a lot of the existential literature is proto-philosophy, and that's probably also my opposition to some of it, like Camus' Stranger. I feel like it is.
Have we decided you've read that or no?
No, but I listened to the lecture on the whole.
Same thing.
Isn't the same at all?
Like the question of deciding, yes, I think I read it. I think I read it in college, but it's been too long and I don't remember right now. Whatever. But the point though is there's obviously the presentation of a psychopath character.
Yes.
And he's actually a psychopath. But the presentation of, for one, Camus not knowing the characteristics of a psychopath and how this works, it does a good job, right? But also as a therapist coming to it, like, it's off a little bit. And that's what I feel like that's kind of what I feel like from Dostoevsky too. Like I feel like you're doing good proto-psychology that's really meaningful, and but it's also off enough that it like makes you go,
Okay. This is why I said you made such a good point by bringing up the psychology, because we argue about this with Crime Punishment all the time. He's like, oh, but he's like not a sociopath. I was like, okay, he's not. The point of Crime and Punishment is not to present a sociopath. That is not the point of the story.
he's not a sociopath enough.
Absolutely.
That's not the point of the story. And also, there was no DSM. There was no such thing as psychology when Dostoevsky was writing, which makes it incredible.
Yeah.
So,
in context of the time and the information, that's what I was thinking with Camus too. And so I feel like it's an unfair judgment that I'm having, the fact that this is a concession. I'm making a concession. Aren't I gracious?
I got so you got it on recording. What you're saying,
yeah.
But maybe from a little bit different angle. Nathan's problem here is he wants the book, and whether it's to conform to a kind of a textbook kind of what psychopathy is or whatever. Real people are messy.
Yeah.
They don't behave exactly according to any textbook sort of thing. And Dostoevsky's great genius is that he writes about a human being, Raskolnikov, in real, and he really enfleshes him so well. Yeah. And all of his messiness and contradictions, his strengths, his weaknesses, his doubts, his self-doubt, his fears, all of this, even though it doesn't fit any textbook description of any of this, it fits the real messiness of life, and that's why it's great literature. Well, am I right or wrong? Or am I off?
I was like, you should make that at me because that's what I'm going to object to.
No. I think that's true.
Okay.
And I also think I think that's very true. But I also think it works so well on a literal level, but it works so well on a symbolic level, which I think is
that's what she likes. That's what I think is
which I think is his real point.
Do we need to like?
Can I-
continue it up, or-
No,
So-
I want to
So
drop
it's more than Raskolnikov as a man who has.
Yeah.
I want to drop
I mean,
something
I
in.
try
What's the more?
I mean,
Can I clean up my art?
I read it.
Because they
No.
I read it
No.
differently every time. Sometimes I read it as a man redeemed.
Yes.
Maybe. I don't know if I necessarily buy his redemption. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't.
Yeah.
Because I feel So, and then sometimes I read it as, socio-political commentary and, a rejection of Hegelianism. So, I don't know. So I will read it differently each time.
Right.
So sometimes I like it literally, sometimes I like it symbolically. It does
I'm
depend.
not giving
I would also, I would argue that
we all struggle with our own self doubts and our own.
I would argue that as a literary author, his point was not to write about psychology.
Yeah.
I haven't read it, so I can't actually go in depth.
So you should come to our debate. Like we're actually going to try to have a formal debate. If I get somebody to moderate, I don't know. But
I mean, I plan on reading it, so if you need me to come on,
go ahead. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
But from an authorial perspective, I'm not writing my characters to be completely correct in the way that they function. I'm more focused on what are the themes that they're portraying in how they act, rather than making sure. Now, I want them to seem human.
Yeah.
I want them to act like people, sometimes irrationally like people.
Yeah.
I would love to talk to you about one of my characters.
Okay.
which one, Abigail?
Grandpa.
I feel like Abigail
would be fun too. But when I'm focusing on that, I'm more focused on what is this doing story-wise.
Of course.
And
Here's the
thematically, rather than is this person acting like a psychopath, or am I correctly portraying multiple personality disorder? Sure.
Right.
Now, see, I can definitely understand.
That's why
you're not
Abigail-
thinking am I correctly portraying this? These DSM criteria. When I've written, I would say, and obviously every author's different.
Mm-hmm.
I would think, for me, theme is always secondary. I'm like, I know this character. This character is a flesh and blood human being to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
This character is going to do this.
Find out what they're going to do.
They write themselves.
They will
I
write
would-
themselves because I know this
I would
character's
agree with
human
you.
and I know what they're going to do.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
would agree with you in that.
Yeah.
But I'm also sitting there thinking thematically, like, what are
I'm
I'm not going to make a character do something that is out of who they are,
Obviously, yeah.
but I'm also at the same time shaping and forming the character to present specific themes.
Okay.
Of course.
What about the danger, though, that your characters become caricatures? They become they're so built
You still
around
have
that
one thing.
theme, and they've
So
got
but I would argue
become
that
flat. What?
there are times for caricatures and there are times for characters.
Uh-huh.
So one, I think I talked to you about this. We're way off topic, but one is allegory. Within allegory, you want caricatures.
Yes. With a good,
And then an
with
author.
a good kids book where you want themes, or not necessarily kids, but younger reader book where you want really good themes, caricatures are also really nice. And they're also very well accepted in society.
But at
For
the same
instance,
time,
And they can
Harry
still be
Potter
great literature.
Harry
Potter, yeah.
but at the same time,
characters.
there's a
Yeah.
place for caricatures, but there's also a place for characters.
Yes.
And so to go back to, just so I can not have my position like straw man, nobody really, you can fit diagnostic criteria for something from the DSM, but nobody's actually like that as a person. Everybody's missing complex. My thing is not that he doesn't fit any specific, my thing is I don't feel like he's coherent. I don't feel like he's a person. I don't feel like actually people act that way. So that's my argument.
Raskolnikov?
Yeah, Raskolnikov. Yeah.
I come from Tennessee. Raskolnikov.
That's him, right? But I feel like he's not he doesn't, like Camus' character is a psychopath, and I think that's actually a pretty good description of psychopath, except maybe toward the end, but I think that makes much more sense. But like Raskolnikov's not supposed to be a psychopath, but he's not psychopathic enough. I mean, he doesn't seem to have enough of that. He's not convincing, but that's our own debate. So,
but he's also not supposed to be sociopath.
But in order to engage in crime, you need a certain amount of psychopathy in order to be able to do this, right? And so he's not meeting the minimum threshold for me to believe that he's going to be violent. That's my thought process. He's thinking about the world in a way that like somebody who's going to commit this violence is not going to think about the world. Mm-hmm. And so that's my problem. I mean, like having no people that commit violence and having worked with psychopaths. Like I had this one kid that was a crazy psychopath. It was really fun. Yeah.
All right, we'll save it.
Yeah,
we'll save it. If you moderate, it'd be
only
great.
Yeah, I had this one kid that was a crazy psychopath. It was so fun. That was so much fun.
This is why I did crisis service for 10 years. It's like always something new and exciting. And wildly crazy.
Well,
but yeah, that anyway.
To get back to a little bit to art and so forth, there's always the way art or music, grunge rock, anything, jazz. Mm-hmm. I think jazz and existentialism,
yeah, I think so.
they arise about a generation apart. I think one is very much an expression of the other. But I think always, if you look at the arts of any time period, you're going to see the prevailing public philosophy. Mm-hmm. If you know what to look for, there's always a worldview.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
In every painting, every novel, every television program, every whatever, every poem,
every anything,
yeah. And all of it's a conversation. There's one thing about philosophy. We want to say it starts with Plato. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Descartes picks up what Plato was saying and even parallels him a little bit, and reinvigorates rationalism for a whole new age, and he creates that whole new age. By the way, he says, I'm going to replace Aristotle in the schools. And he did it.
Well,
it's not bragging, it's fact. What?
The math,
yeah. But the reaction of Romanticism has taken paths that I think have been destructive of good order of society, of moral goodness, of all kinds of things. If you look at when existentialism became popular, pop culture, when did that begin?
When existentialism became popular.
It became pop culture. When it filtered down into the way people actually lived.
Oh, 60s? Well, no. 60s.
60s.
The hippies were the 20s and 70s.
The hippies were intentionally rejecting living up to expectations and will to power, projecting themselves, making themselves their own kind of people, and so forth. And they won. You look at the world today, it's the world that the hippie movement created.
Yeah.
And they had some wonderful high ideals, and I think that's honorable. But at the same time, they tossed out too much, and we haven't recovered it. And the church hasn't really responded.
Well, yeah, because the church gave up on philosophy, like when it needs to be paying close attention. So I've had a criticism forever. But let me go back to and to bring this towards not exactly a conclusion, but at least towards a coherent.
No conclusion. Yeah.
Towards a coherent closure to some of the conceptualization. Like, I believe that what a lot of the existentialism was attempting to do was to move towards, like, wisdom literature for our time. Mm-hmm. And so it was trying to be like some of the Greco-Roman, like a more modern reflection like Greco-Roman moralists. But the point, though, is that we get into some guys like that are worth mentioning that people aren't going to know as well. But like Viktor Frankl. Mm-hmm. Okay, Viktor Frankl, anyone? So he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And then he wrote another book, which I thought was really interesting, called, and just a brilliantly different title, which was Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning.
So different.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh.
like
Wow, that was
the first one was he was a psychiatrist who was put in the Nazi concentration camps. He was at Dachau and something else, and he almost died and whatever else.
Yeah.
But he was writing about his experience, and part of what he came away with was he essentially, because he had already read like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, which is always interesting because he references Kierkegaard in there too. But the point is he's saying that, you know, and maybe this is a Nietzsche quote, but like he who has a why can survive, like he who has a why can survive anyhow. Yeah, like however, like as long as you have a sense of purpose. Yeah, that's right. As long as you have a sense of purpose and you actually have a sense of meaning in your life, you can survive basically anything. So he would talk about people in the camps who would just like lay down and die because they just gave up. They were just like, well, okay, nothing's going to happen. They just lay down and starve to death, like right where they were. And just, you know, and he's like, the only thing that can help you survive that kind of situation and is to have a sense of purpose. And so this is something that Sartre referring to, and some of these other thinkers are like, we have to create our own purpose. And he created what was an existential counseling. Like, this is how you go about engaging in psychotherapy in an existential sense. And that was, you know, much more in his second book. But then he influenced Martin. It's written Buber, and I prefer pronouncing it Buber, but it's actually pronounced Buber.
Martin Buber, yeah.
Okay, you know him. Okay, great. So
I know now, yeah.
Yeah. So just the last name is like I know I'm like 8th grade, but whatever. Anyhow, so Buber has this great sense of I thou. Like, how do we actually confront another person as a whole human being? And myself as a whole human being, and how do we actually have this interaction between ourselves as authentic, which would be very existential, individuals, very existential, and he has this conceptualization that I think moved a lot of counseling. So moved towards some humanistic counseling. You have Abraham Maslow was along those lines. Who else before I get to my guys? Carl Rogers, obviously. Yeah. So Carl Rogers is doing very, very much like supporting the individual. But then he also influenced Fritz Perls, who is a little less well known. Yeah. And so Fritz Perls is a hero of mine. Like one of I think his entire life was ridiculous and not praiseworthy per se at all, but the intellectual conceptualization that he and Gold whatever. He and a couple other people were working together. The names don't come to my mind right now, which is sad. But anyway, but they put together into Gestalt therapy, which was there was actually already a Gestalt psychology, which was just a regular branch of psychology, and they took from that, but they wanted to separate themselves, so they called it Gestalt therapy. But it's really a philosophy of how the brain works, how we process interactions, how we interact with each other as human beings, and I feel like that's the most philosophic kind of or version of psychology available, and that's my entire approach to everything is like Gestalt psychology. But there are a lot of other thinkers that are kind of similar or along those lines. So I feel like what ended up happening is the wisdom project that was kind of started in these big questions that were being asked there moved itself into psychology proper,
right?
But then also got moved into like subsets of counseling because it was a practical enacted idea. So this is actually what got me into as being a therapist. Like the idea of like wisdom is going to be something you have to enact, and to enact it, you have to be doing this with somebody. So this is like where I see counseling going. But then the problem is this postmodern nihilism has worked itself back into the therapy now to the point where we have all these kinds of therapeutic processes that you're essentially required to engage in, or either socially shamed into engaging in, whether they're effective or not, whether you're supposed to be evidence-based, but like I've never seen any evidence-based research on body positivity, but like if you do something that's not body positive, they'll probably like hang you up.
Right.
So it's, you know, there's the social mood has started to affect, you know, back into that. But anyway, I feel like what happened to philosophy generally and the actual search for wisdom ended up like embedding itself in the existentialist movement and then into psychology and then into this like little corner of psychology that's like maybe Jordan Peterson and some other people are trying to protect, but mostly it's like hiding in a corner.
And there are reasons for that, both historical and academic and
sociological,
and all kinds of things. To some extent, I want to get big picture again based on something what you were just saying, but I've been hearing a little bit here. Existentialism is an effort to move beyond philosophy as a dry set of doctrines and to move into philosophy as an outgrowth of and producer of real lived existence, real life.
Authentic Catholic.
Authentic language. But that's an academic term.
Well, authentic
It comes down to living a real life. And Christian existentialism is living a real life before God, the ultimate thou.
Yeah, I would say C.S. Lewis is a Christian existentialist.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I've never thought of him that way. I mean, I go.
Mere Christianity, how's this? Okay, go ahead.
You give me about a year to think about that. That's profound. But ultimately, the big problem with postmodernism, which is where you're getting psychology into this little corner, at least just
beaten back into
this little corner. The whole problem with it is the idea that you construct yourself. That there is no essence to what it means to be a man, a woman, a child, a human being of any kind. To be middle-aged, to be old, to be young. There's no model, no form in Plato's terminology. But you have to construct your sense of selfhood yourself. And what you get from this is ultimately all kinds of perversity. Sexual perversions of all kinds, not just transgenderism and all of that, but sexual perversity of every possible kind, including pedophilia and all.
Yes, moving into these
that didn't exist 50 years ago, but they're around now.
Well, that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, when essence preceding
existence.
And if you take out the essence, what's left?
Well, that's something.
But I think you're backward there, though, because I think it's a move towards Plato, and I was curious. I was curious if you were thinking the same thing I was thinking there, or not.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to essence precedes existence. That's the Bible. It is.
But we'll see.
Therefore, there are no Christian existentialists, because if I'm following the Bible at all, even no matter how lightly, the Bible tells me that essence precedes existence. Where existentialism, okay, we infer it. God worked
theology for that one.
Well, God worked according to a plan in the creation.
Also you're
He
applying.
didn't create Adam to find out what he would do is the way we do in writing.
Sure, but you're also moving God into time. I would reject the very idea of God created from a plan. Like simultaneity would be implied in the creation process because time hadn't been created yet.
I would say the creation of time was simultaneous with the creation of the creation.
So
God worked in creation from outside it.
Here's where I would go, because I don't need to convince you of that, but what I could convince you of is that you're making claims that I don't think have any relevance or anything. I don't think they're theological claims. I think they are philosophical claims that don't have any reference that you could ever actually investigate. So I think you're making claims you couldn't possibly know.
He dismisses me in such a nuanced way. Nothing sweeping here.
Yeah.
I feel the breeze, brother.
Sorry.
No, seriously.
I feel like if I were a teacher and you said that, I would say, show me the textual reference.
Yeah, give me the verse, because you're not going to
The
get
chapter and verse.
And you're also not, I don't even think you're going to be able to make, this is going to get into like we should have a debate or something, but I don't think you're even going to be able to get to a coherent theology that gets you there. Like, I don't think Plato's evidence. But let me bring it back to what you were saying about the current society, because I think what they're doing is recreating Plato. They're creating an essence. I am the essence of a 6-year-old black girl, and you can't tell me I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
They're referencing, they have the individual, they don't have, like in your version, God has a claim to what the essence actually is, right?
Yes.
And in their version, there's
you're not a 6-year-old black girl, you're a 27-year-old, 30-year-old, whatever.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
You're denying your essence.
Yeah.
You're calling yourself a 6-year-old black girl.
Sure.
Yeah.
So So, but the
How big she won't?
the
He's like 40s.
yeah
Okay, you're 40.
That was it. You weren't joking.
no.
But I momentarily forgot that you look younger than you really are. It comes to
You're getting into like a thing that she freaks out
clean
about.
living is what it does.
Absolutely, it's good stress management. I would suggest.
You can't clean live your way into even close to resembling a 6-year-old black girl.
I'm sorry, I might be in the wrong spot. I'm sorry, this is the wrong spot. I'm sorry.
This is not my quilting society.
Here's the and so this is why I would like to have a discussion with you about the non-binary question, right? Because both sides, like if we have to split this into, and I know this is like way off topic, I guess maybe. If we split this into left and right, let's just call it, just for simplicity's sake, I think both sides are just wildly, absurdly naive or the way they're approaching things, right? So that would be, I mean, if you wanted to pick a side on that, like it would matter. But like, it's so much more complicated than they're making it into. And
Wait, which side are we talking
I
about?
think a lot of, like, let's just try to pick the subset of, I wanted to have a debate with somebody on this, and I tried with her twice, and it just fell apart. And like, I fully think that's my fault too. Like, it's just so hard to even have a single discussion about like the question of whether you can
Everything
be
I said
non-binary.
was like, no, you're off topic. I'm like, it's the topic, right?
Yeah.
It has to do with transgenderism and self-selecting what sex I am or what sex I identify.
See, that's biological sex. That's not gender presentation. So there's a lot of problems is that you're not playing the same language game, right?
Yeah.
So they have a very complex language game that they're playing, and there are problems that language game solves that the right doesn't notice. But then obviously they create more problems and then they just ignore it, right? So both sides are just wildly living in their own self-deception is what I would say.
It's human
Therefore, I think we should pull postmodernism out and just say that language is terrible. And if the language is creating all of these problems,
Yes. Let's all just sit you know?
Yes. Somebody will
We'll start with we'll just go around the
What we really need is that, like, what is it? In the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, Flint's like mind reader thing where it would put the headband on and then have the little
just wait, Elon Musk will give it to you.
Yeah. Or the what's it from the Hitchhiker's Guide to Everything, like the My Point of View gun or the Point of View gun.
No, don't do that.
Oh, it's great. There's like this. It's another.
Actually, yeah, I need to read that one.
It's good. Basically, there's this gun. It's called the Point of View gun, and when you shoot someone with it, they have to speak your point of view on a certain topic.
Nice.
Oh, I love that.
So,
oh man.
so like if Nathan were to shoot someone, then they would start spouting Nathan's point of view on the X
She'll
topic.
never let me have it.
But the thing was, the gun was developed to like solve like world problems or something like that. So like when there's all these like conflicts and people can't get along, it's like here's the point of view gun, so you can understand each other's point of view.
Yeah.
So
Nice if it was that. Right.
Let's go back to this subject of language games for a minute, can we?
Yeah.
I think there's a problem. Well, one thing, there's some legitimacy to the whole idea. There are different language games in different fields, you know, and sometimes the fields overlap and the language games do not. I'm not going to question that for a minute. I do want to question whether all language games are equal. Nope, they are not. There's some that are more useful than others, some are more coherent than others. And the true test, some are more conformable to reality than others. And one of the real problems with gender and identity and all of that is that sometimes the language games, as I am a 6-year-old black girl, the language games get completely divorced from any kind of empirical reality. And you can study, you know, African American culture and all that, and try to talk like the 6-year-old.
Yeah.
But you're just someone playing a role.
Because
you'll never be that. So, yeah, appropriating, although I don't think that's always a bad thing. But you are playing a language game that's illegitimate. And the same thing, if you want to say that the whole non-binary movement has its own language game, yes, they do.
Well,
sometimes it's not the source of reality.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And no, the difficulty there. This is the thing Jordan Peterson. Anyway, whatever.
Jordan Peterson.
The value of language is our ability to enact or move towards certain ends, right? And so the problem is the right doesn't recognize the ways in which certain ends are. Like, if you see, do you know Blair White? Anybody know Blair White? She is a male to female transsexual, but she definitely looks like a she. Now, when I'm saying she now, I am referring to her presentation, because if we were in a restaurant and I say, where do you want to sit? Well, why don't you sit by her? You're going to know what I say. If I say, why don't you sit by him? You're going to be like, who? What?
Right.
And so in that context, in social linguistic context, you need to be able to have the right visualization when I say the word. If I'm going to a doctor and if she gets injured and I take her to the hospital, then I'm going to, and they're saying like, well, he is a 20-something-year-old guy, so you may need to know the medical information for that. So now I'm moving from a biological language, a sociological language game for presentation and ease of access or ease of understanding to a biological description for medical necessity. But the real problem, or the real thing that you're getting there, is like each one of these each of these language games ends up creating its own concept of the human soul to some extent. Like you have other kin or whatever, people who think they were born as a deer, right? But the movement is in a rejection of the wholesale conceptualization of Christianity or anything that's traditional, right? But now as I'm doing as just like Dugan said, like as I'm doing the smorgasbord version, and I am you had the word earlier, I am the locus of reality or something.
Locus of consciousness.
Yeah.
I am nothing more than a locus of consciousness. Everything else is added on, either given to me by society or created by myself.
And that's like,
the moral imperative is to create it myself if you're existentialist.
Yeah. Sheesh. There was a word you said there that it was early enough, didn't I? But the point though is, as we move to this smorgasbord kind of idea, like I can pick whatever it is, they're actually creating another concept of the soul while also rejecting the concept of the soul. Because it's so fascinating. Naruto. You guys watch Naruto?
That's a fun way of putting it.
You guys ever watch Naruto?
No.
Oh, wow. Okay, so
God
bless you all.
I tell you, 90% of the questions that you ask me start with, have you watched? The answer is no.
So Naruto is an anime that's extremely popular, and I force you to watch a bunch of stuff, but that's another story.
Yes, I know. I'm so good now.
You're like up on pop culture, but Naruto is a very popular anime. It's been around forever. This was like 2002, I guess, when it started. Somewhere in that range, maybe the 90s. But in the first season, Naruto comes upon this female presenting character and immediately starts calling this female presenting character he. And I'm like, what? And I'm confused as I'm watching the show. Who's he talking about? And then the character later comes up and says, oh, by the way, I'm a boy, to somebody else. And like, this all happens, it doesn't happen in this order, but it's good enough for you to understand what I'm saying. But the point, though, is how did Naruto or the people that were with him know that this was a he to correctly use the right pronouns before even meeting the person, before having any interaction with them? Like, the only thing is that they're reading some soul, some essence of this person, some actual thing that's beyond the physical. And this is so interesting in terms of, does that make sexuality and the physical sex organs essentially into the soul, because they're still hidden and they're unseen. And so now the whole, everything that's unseen must necessarily be part of the soul. And it's like this really confusion with our internal essence and then this physicality thing that is also like kept away from sight. But I think it's interesting. It's just this: the sexuality ends up taking the place of the soul in Christian thought.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that existentialism. We're going to
bring it back. Yeah, bring it back, please.
evil of existentialism here. It made experience central. At least one strain of it did. And the most easily accessible kind of experience is sexual feeling. I mean, it's accessible to just about everyone. It's instantly attractive, repulsive, whatever. That's why so many popular songs are about, sexual relations. you're cheating hard. I hate you. I love you.
Gosh.
We act so good until it do.
My mind goes to WAP, and you're going to cheat, but you guys probably don't. Hopefully, never mind.
Williams wrote
Yeah, for me, it's have you listened to? 90% is going to be no.
Anybody got a rap?
What now? What have I done?
Okay. Now, not that I was just like one of those horrible songs and whatever, but
Which
it's
one?
Don't. I can't even tell you the name. Like literally, one a huge popular song that 5 years ago that is just.
Oh, I wouldn't know it.
No, but that's what
I said, was it 5 years ago?
I feel.
Wait, is it the
17?
Is it the pop song where it's the guy talking about all of the different ethnics he likes to have sex
Like
with?
legitimately, I don't
Or is that a
understand
different song that I'm thinking about?
It's called WAP because I can't say either of the three words. Like, anyway, but never mind. But the thing is, like, it's moved so far from your cheating heart.
They say, and that's how sex sells. You know?
Yeah.
It motivates people. Therefore, we write. If you want to get a pop song that sells a million records, you write it about sex, about relation, love, and all this kind of stuff.
Because it goes to the basal, it goes to that base level of the brain, that like the lizard brain of like, it's the fastest form of like it's animalistic.
Actually, if I was going to expand on that, my chapter on the sublime would reference the ways in which we confront things that are apparently infinite, and the sexual drive is apparently infinite, and so therefore it seems divine. But that's another.
Oh, I mean, Tantric Hinduism does.
Oh, yeah.
But the problem is that once you deny the soul, I am my body.
Yep.
I am my physical side. Sexuality replaces the soul because it's the deepest part of our identity. If there is no soulish side of our identity, if my identity is my body, well then sex, food,
Must be the most
power. I think even for he wants power too, doesn't he?
He wants attention, and he's narcissistic. So yeah, he wants to be famous.
I think everyone, if you ask me, this is just my personal self-philosophy, but I mean, it's based on the Bible, but everyone wants power in one way or another. It just all takes different forms.
Yeah.
Well, everyone needs some amount of power. Otherwise, you can't get your needs met. I mean, like in some basic sense, that's not. It's not an inherent evil. That's why we were given ethical, deontological. This is why I wanted to do ethics. But like this is why we were given deontological, because you can have a narcissist or a sociopath that's narcissistic and sociopathic. If they act within the bounds of some kind of ethical commitments and don't act outside of that, they'd be fine. I mean, like you don't have to not be. And that David would be the perfect example. Like he's a Christian psychopath, and he still acts like a psychopath, but he also acts ethically within.
And I think that's the kind of the point of the part of sin is that we were given the image of God, so we have that capacity to have dominion over it. But when sin warped, it's we replaced ourselves with God, and so that power can no longer be satiated. Is why we're always searching for something in one way or another.
Yeah.
So,
if there is a meta-narrative, a structure to society, then there's a way for me somewhere within the sphere of that, if it's well structured, for me to gain the power I need and want.
Right.
In a completely open, existential, project yourself into an unknown future kind of world, then I never know if I've made it or not, do I?
No.
Which is all kinds of cycles.
Well, eventually know that you didn't make it because you get old and die.
That's a good point.
I mean, like that's.
So what's good in that?
The 3 warnings of the Buddha, right? I mean, like that's to switch topics though, but age and death and illness. I mean, like you're not. This is the Jobe point too, because you are confronted with your finiteness, your inability to become God. You are not God, and to the extent that you reject that or trying to fight against that, you are just beating your head against the wall and injuring yourself at best. And so that's I think the point of existentialism. That's why I like it.
Existentialism. But in a truly existentialism, if the universe is open, or if my identity is completely open, it is not predetermined by anything. Not by God, not even by biology. But by my own decision, I never know if I've made the right decision. It leads to a kind of uncertainty that will
The Disney
because you don't have a standard to measure yourself against,
Yes.
right? If we're all in our own different vacuums, how are we able to kind of gauge like where am I on where I want to be, except for the ideas.
Well, this is what actually
Exactly.
Maslow has resolved. Maslow and Kohlberg and some of the psychologists can actually resolve some of that. I mean, like because and Jordan Peterson's saying this too. Like some of this is actually resolvable problems that are not even so philosophic anymore. But there's something else. What was the first part you said there?
I said everyone's in their own vacuums.
Kierkegaard has the phrase "the dizzying heights of freedom," and he writes a book about anxiety, and that's what he's calling anxiety. Is the fact that, like, as if you're standing on a cliff and you look down the height and you're like, "I could throw myself off of this." Like, I'm not going to. But, or maybe you wouldn't, but like there is the potential for my life to change dramatically at any moment if I were to make the wrong decision,
right,
or to do something off.
Have you heard of that effect in the brain, the call?
Oh, the jump, yeah.
That's such an interesting.
Well,
I remember the first time I felt it was really weird.
Yeah, the intention to test our limits but that's also the sublime as well. Like the thing that is overpowering and overwhelming and bigger than I am, and a recognition of ourselves in context of the overpowering, overwhelming universe, which is Job again. That's why I just said, like, well, if somebody's not here to rein me in, will we ever get out of Job? Because I feel like it covers like almost all.
Job raises a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But if you bring with it a presupposition that God is a metaphor, or God equals the universe, you never get out of the problem.
Right.
It's the goodness of God, with the conundrum of the goodness of God, and God's unwillingness to interfere in the situation that leaves Job a fascinating mystery. But the challenge is to trust the goodness of God, again, as an absolute goodness, not just a goodness that I find pleasing, but somehow God is good apart from my conception of goodness, obviously. And I trust His goodness even if there's never one whit of evidence in my life. What if the last chapter of Job didn't get back houses, children?
It doesn't matter that he did, because that's only a child's answer to the problem. This is one of the things that Jung says, is like in a children's story, the person gets back things, and then and that is made the thing that makes them okay. But if you lose children, just because you have more children doesn't mean that you don't. You've had an infinite loss, and you can't just replace it with more children, right? And so it's a child's interpretation to take Job and be like, God gave him stuff back, right? I mean, I'm sorry to say, like that's literally how. But
in the story, it's presented that way, though, almost.
Well, I think so. I think because
that's a little detail that, that's huge.
Because I think it's speaking to multiple levels. Like, I think it's speaking to multiple levels of existence. So it is presenting itself for a child in a certain sense, in the superficial. But there's also the way in which all of us, and this is going to be like super deep for you. So let me see if I can organize it.
Please.
Wow.
I'm sorry. I'm not organized this thought process to make it clear. So I'm trying to. It's the coherence that I'm expressing, not your. The fact that all of us as Christians have taken on the role of Christ, the baptism, like what was talked about in Sunday school or service, anyway. We are making a choice to become martyrs at some point by an authentic Christianity. And Job, if he was able to be pulled out of that situation, and God asked, like, would you be willing to be this example for the rest of humanity? One assumes as a righteous man he would say, yes, give me all that suffering. I will be that martyr to be an example. So God may as well have asked him, but we can almost conclude that whether we can conclude or whether we have already committed, we are somewhat committing to martyrdom because we're saying we know God's plan is better, even if I'm getting chewed up,
But I think that's because we have a perspective of eternity, where we look and say, I can endure it's Romans 8. I can endure the pain and the groanings of birth pains now, because the sufferings now cannot be compared to the glory to come. Whereas if you abandon if you take that out,
Nietzsche.
You have Nietzsche.
Go ahead,
and you have this, there is no I'm going to avoid suffering as much as possible because there's no end. There's no point to it. Where
life is better without suffering.
And it's better. And if this is the only existence, I'm going to avoid suffering as much as possible to have the most pleasant existence I can. Yeah. Whereas our perspective is we can suffer now because we know that 80 years of suffering has nothing to do with an eternity of blessing.
If I can make the analogy, it's kind of like two men who are sent to prison. One is sentenced for a life sentence, so he knows he's going to be there, like his whole life's going to be prison, and the other one's like sentenced for maybe like 20 years, and he knows he's going to be in prison a while, but he knows he's going to get out. And so one man, he realizes he's going to get out at some point, and so his perspective on the prison is going to look much different than the man who knows he's going to be there for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And the man who is, this is my life now, he's going to make the most of the prison he's in because that's his life. Whereas the man who has 20 years, he knows that there's life after this, so he might not be as invested in his life in the prison, maybe looking more forward to the life that is to come.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I also don't want to mischaracterize Nietzsche.
Yeah, I agree with it. Yeah.
Cool. To say that he was pleasure-seeking.
No, he's the opposite.
Yeah, he had his idea of eternal recurrence, which was if you had to live this life again and again and again and again, would you be making the same decisions again? And
because you will have to,
so just think of.
But he's also a little too pain. Like he's like take on as much because it makes you stronger and it makes you more powerful. And if you don't have a choice in the first place, you might as well will it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was the opposite of what you're saying is true.
Discussing Nietzsche and just
no.
But I threw it in there. It didn't quite match apparently what you were saying, so then it sounded like
no. It just triggered the thought of
I wonder if the opposite, the guy who's going to be in prison 20 years has a purpose. He has a reason to look forward to that day, to live for that day when he comes free. He has a lot of time to think. He ponders. He plans. What am I going to do when I get out? How will I survive? He reads. He devours everything in the prison library and blah, blah, blah. The guy who's in for life and knows he's in for life without any hope of parole might as well lay down and die and quit eating and, I'm here for the rest of my life. Let's make it as short as possible. Not make the most of it while I'm in prison.
Or the other way is, let me try to become basically the bully or the top man in the prison.
Right.
Let me make everyone subject to myself. Let me make this prison life, even though I'm going to be here, this is my life now, to make the most of it and the best of it, and take everything that I can that this life has to offer.
Yeah, and I think something that's interesting about that perspective that they're talking about is it parallels perfectly with Christianity, because we are looking at this as Christians. This is the closest to hell we'll get, and we get heaven after we're done.
Right.
Whereas everybody else, this is the closest to heaven they will get. So they're making it as close to heaven as they can get, and then they'll get hell.
That's a good point.
So it's it's a perfect foil.
And I think also it's important to note that just because the man who's in there for 20 years, he has that hope, he's still 20 years, and there's going to be times and periods where he just forgets that. He's just going to be hopeless, it feels like I'm going to be in here forever. And he's, I feel like humans are very in the moment kind of people. So it's hard. It's just really insight source. I think, I think it's important to note that, because I think there are Christians, and I think everyone falls subject to it, kind of like Job, right, where he's lamenting the fact that his life sucks, and it does. And does he remember that there is hope for the future? Yes, he does, but at the same time, life still sucks. And so,
absolutely.
I think that's kind of because I think sometimes Christianity is like, oh, why are you so downcast? You should be happy because you're going to get out in 20 years. and then the other people are like, I'm still in prison. What do you want from me? Stop telling me to be happy when I'm in this mess.
Yeah.
Stop telling me to be happy when I've been it's hell on earth basically. So
Yeah. I've never been a fan of that brand of Christianity that says, oh, I've lost my job, my dog died, the car's broken down, but I still have Jesus. Ain't it wonderful?
It reminds me of
That's just not real. When life sucks, as you put it, then it does. And there you are. And might as well admit it.
Yeah.
And I think it's better that we embrace that and accept the fact that, oh man, life does suck. And then making kind of, not to say we're the man who has life sentence, but kind of understand we are where we are right now, and we have to kind of make the most.
Okay, so I finally organized my thoughts that I was saying. So the point is, we are crucified with Christ. This life is our crucifixion. That's how I want to say it. And that's what Job's doing. That experience is his crucifixion, and that is the thing that we commit to by being saved.
He doesn't know it at the time, though.
Well,
but when we figure it out,
that's true. And also, it's an act. It's faith. I mean, it's there's no rational getting to this makes sense or this could make sense or whatever.
So Job's faith never really fails. I've read that before, that Job's faith never fails. I tend to want to read him as if it did. I mean, he's complaining against God, he's whining in some places.
Yeah, but if be honest, at the same time, you get that in Psalms.
Yeah.
With multiple Psalms.
And you even...
utter lamentations.
God, what are you doing?
You see even in Job, the fact that he's like, God, I still think you're real, but why the heck is this happening to me? And God, I still trust in you, but I really don't feel like trusting in you right now. So you still have that faith.
Absolutely.
It's just that
brutally honest.
Yeah, which I think is really can kind of miss out.
And I think that also is the point, when you look at Job, God does restore Job. I think because he kept the faith, even though he was distraught and complained all the time, he still kept the faith, and God restored him in the end because of that. And that's why he was called the righteous man, not because he was a good person, but because he kept the faith. And that's kind of how,
he was justified by faith.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole gospel, is we are justified by faith. We are made righteous by our faith. He stayed righteous not because he complained against God, where some Christians were if you complain against God, man, that's not righteous at all. But he kept the faith. He still believed, and that's why God restored him in the end. And that's why, as Christians, when we believe in Christ, that faith gives us the righteousness. So while we're still suffering on the cross, he will restore us when we get to heaven, when our 20 years are up.
So the question then, what then does Job repent of at the end? He says, I repent in dust and ashes.
I think it's his, I wouldn't say his pride, his self-righteousness of, because God says,
I deserve better.
Yeah, because Job is God, why have you done this to me? And God's I have a bunch of other billion people I'm taking care of as well. It's not
that whole idea.
Get off your high horse.
It's that whole idea of the fact that man is sinful and we deserve hell.
Yeah.
So therefore, God can very justly have that happen to us and say, "This is just. You deserve this, but I will have grace and mercy on you."
Well, I would suggest that to what extent he is turning from one way of being to another way of being, to use it, for repentance.
Yeah.
Is his expectation that he has to actually know what's going on. That's the thing. No, you don't have to know what's going on all the time.
And that also goes back to what I was saying earlier about knowledge is power, and knowledge, you just want to be able to control things in him. Job wanted to know what was going on, so this is my interpretation. Doesn't mean I'm correct, but I think that Job wanted to know what was going on.
Of course
he wanted to know so that he could fix the situation.
Well, it gives suffering meaning. Right?
Yeah, it gives suffering
So
meaning.
this is what I was saying about Viktor Frankl and some of the existentialists in terms of counseling. Is like, I can survive anything if I know what it means.
Yeah.
I'm not always given a picture of what something means right now while we're having to survive it.
Right.
You don't deserve it. And his expectation is that I'm being righteous. I should at least know why I'm suffering.
Yeah.
And like, no.
And I think it's also the human pride to think we have the right to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would we take suffering better if we always knew how it was going to come out? If Job had known, well, I'm going to have twice as many fields, I'm going to have twice as many children, and it's all
I think
that
he was surviving.
Good deal to me.
Surviving with the right attitude.
At that point, what are you placing your faith in? Are you placing your faith in God to sustain you through this, or are you placing your faith in the rewards of sustaining?
What's your motive?
What's your motive?
Yeah.
Because if you can see this is the end of my suffering, you may be able to endure it, but you're enduring it for the wrong reason.
And like,
Right,
I think my answer
is going to be out, and he lives for that, not for something else. The man,
Virtue ethics. Sorry.
Job, if he had known how it was going to end up, he would not have worked through the crisis of faith he went through.
yeah, his faith would not have changed.
That's huge.
But
I think about that one.
well, here's here to add to that too, because I would say this is why I was thinking of doing ethics, because it's a virtue ethics question. He was already committed, so you have this guy who's operating the way he wanted to operate, and then he gets picked on, right? So he demonstrates that he is in Kierkegaard's ethical sphere by not breaking that commitment. He has made this commitment to what I would say as Christians be martyred if necessary. He's made this commitment, so he's still demonstrating he has that commitment. The thing that actually moves him out of just the ethical into that spiritual is that he's doing it with no idea why.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, it has to be a leap of faith. There's no other information available. He's not doing it for a reward. He's just maintaining because
Kind of like
his relationship with God.
to get back to Kierkegaard, kind of like Abraham, the knight of faith, who and God tells him to go kill your son, and he makes that trip to Mount Moriah.
Doesn't get to know why.
They have no idea why, how this fits in with the promise God gave him earlier. He doesn't
But
know.
if
You know, and
no, continue. Sorry.
my point is, what Abraham does is an act of faith because he doesn't know there's going to be a ram in the thicket. If he'd known about the ram in the thicket, it would have been, come on, son, I want to show you some wildlife out here and how sacrifices work. It wouldn't have been the same thing at all.
But, okay, one thing though, I think Paul mentioned, I can't remember where, I'm pretty sure it was Paul, but like, that Abraham came to the conclusion that God must be able to resurrect.
Hebrews.
What?
It's Hebrews.
Yeah.
Yeah, Hebrews, there we go. And so I think that was Abraham's faith. It wasn't, oh man, I don't know how this, well, he did know I don't know how this is going to end, but he came to the conclusion that I'm going to have faith that God can resurrect my son. And that's, I think, very symbolic for Christ, of course, but like that's the faith that God was like, all right, I'll make my covenant with you, and such.
So, interestingly different direction with that too.
Okay.
And this is like wildly different because it's just something I've been kicking around like last week. I've heard this one, but the act of Christian apologetics and attempting to prove the existence of God. If God wanted to have his existence proved, why wouldn't he do it? And if he doesn't do it, then that must be because he doesn't want to do it. And if he doesn't want to do it, why are we spending so much time trying to do it?
I heard somewhere,
Interesting question.
I can't remember where.
It must be that a need, the tension. I mean, the tension of not having the proof must be the necessary component.
So I can't remember where I heard this, but I heard that if God were to spell out in the stars, I am God, or something like that, like something glaringly obvious, people would, like, for the first maybe month or so, people were like, whoa, and then within like a year, people were like, oh yeah, that's just another constellation, and they wouldn't care. Like, if God could scream from the mountains, I am God, and like tell people literally, and it's kind of like what you were saying earlier about like if he talks to you via the culture, right? If he is able to tell you that like verbatim, face to face, eventually it's like it might have an impact for a moment, but as humans we are so desensitized and so prone to desensitization. God would keep needing to do that over and over and over and over and over again with more escalating grandiosity.
Yeah.
And which also then, which you would think, oh, that would be great if God could do that. But he does, in the fact that when we read the Bible, he does that, like, he reveals himself.
It's the God working through small things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not everybody saw Jesus was converted.
Yeah.
Sure.
So.
Well, and what that reminds me of is in the Old Testament with Elijah. Is Elijah or Elisha in the mountain?
Elijah.
And it's God's not in the fire. God's not in the wind. God is in the whisper.
Yeah.
And I didn't list everything there that he wasn't in, but God's in the whisper there, and so it's that. Just. I don't know how to explain it other than we don't really know why he does it, but that's what he does.
I think it's because human nature, we are expecting God to do something big, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like God loves to subvert our expectations, and that's why he started small.
Well, God is big,
Yeah.
but he doesn't have to show himself big
Yeah.
to be God.
Well, if he
Jesus,
if he showed himself big, we wouldn't be alive anymore.
We wouldn't be alive to witness the world. We would go, oh God!
But also, and I think in a very real sense, if God shows himself as big, he again is kind of appealing to that cultural or that brain that. I don't want to say evolutionary part, but kind of that, man, God's revealing himself as top dog, where in that, if he does that, then how evolution works is it's pattern where there is a top dog, but eventually that top dog will be replaced by another one.
Also, this is just,
you're right.
with that, I would reference something in my book, just because this is how I function sometimes. But
You're footnoting yourself, all right?
I do it all the time.
But if God were to show himself big, actually, I'm going to tie it back to the Bible too. But if God were to show himself big, it makes me think of Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
He showed up at Sinai, and what was the reaction of the people? Ah! Don't come near us. Moses, you go up there. And so I have a similar thing where in my book, the main character gets introduced to the God figure in an act of judgment against something else. And her reaction is terror and fear. And so, in a way, if God were to show himself as this big, massive, the reaction is going to be terror and fear. And
Not belief.
Not belief.
Terror, fear, and belief, but not trust.
But it's not going to be
Yeah.
and that's going to be a response.
It's going to
almost
be out of fear.
It makes me think of
Well, it's demons. Demons believe in God. They know God exists.
You're like, oh, you were close.
But they don't actually have faith.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me of how Jesus and God, it's kind of like approaching a small child. If you approach a small child hey, and you're big and animated, most of the small child's and they're gonna run away. But if you get down on their level and you're hey man, and you come down here and you talk to them and you get on their level, they're gonna be more receptive to you. And if you make yourself like them, which is exactly what Christ did. He did not come as some big giant king with fire and brimstone. He came on the child's level, and which is again why he is so adamant about bringing the children to me, and to enter the kingdom of God, you must become like a child. As I don't know, I'm seeing a lot of similarities.
Well, so it's getting late here, so we're gonna have to go. So I'm gonna finish this up, I guess.
Finished.
Yeah, something. I mean,
Well, I think we just defined existentialism because we just discussed for half an hour about what it is, and you said at the beginning it's more of an action.
It's certainly more of an
Definition.
attitude in a series of things that it's responding to more than a definition.
Yeah, I don't think we got your guys'
We've
official.
gone through that.
I don't think I got your official definition of existentialism. I came in late, so we could wrap up with the definition of existentialism again.
I think we started by saying that there is.
There is no,
Yeah.
so it sounds like we can't wrap
Well,
up.
and existentialism is I'll leave you with Kierkegaard because, of course, my guy.
All right.
But as like Kierkegaard was describing what would become existentialism as the frog at the bottom of your beer.
Okay.
So you have,
Frog at the bottom.
yeah, but basically, like you're just drinking all your beer, and then suddenly there's a frog at the bottom, and it's like, what is? Like there's something about the actual nature of existence that you can't just get rid of, you can't explain away. You just don't like, okay, that's just it there.
Yeah.
Now, actually, they sell signs
and it's also like it's something so pleasant and nice. And then it's like,
what
like,
is this?
It's the shop.
They'll actually sell.
Yeah.
In Denmark, they actually sell like beer steins with like a frog made into the bottom of the thing.
Yeah, that's so
like,
funny.
so like,
That's
you'll
cool.
stare at
I
you.
have not seen that.
Yeah.
and it's like this juxtaposition between like something you just like he was saying, like you don't expect it, and there's like, what do? You just have to suck it up, and you can deal with it one of two ways. You can freak out, or you can okay, there's a frog in my beer, you know.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about
Yeah.
life is suffering, and you can either take that and grow greater in faith, or you can go toward that.
So it's more of existentialism is a person's response to the sudden absurdity of life.
Yes, absurdity is actually one of the things that I've written down as a feedback.
No, I said absurdity.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thought we'd gone the whole time.
All existentialism began with life is meaningless in and of itself.
Oh, okay.
And you impose meaning on life, either by the leap of faith or by the leap into nihilism.
Well, yeah, it would be life is meaningless without God, or some form of human created meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you do that.
But existentialism demands a response. The guy who finds that life is meaningless and gets up and goes to work the next day has missed it.
See, part of me wants to
actually really
part of me wants to ask the question:
It's
is
like-
God the frog at the bottom of your beer?
Can we get like business cards that say that and just hand them out right now?
What?
You get little frogs. You get little plastic frogs.
Oh my god!
You get a little water, you just drop the frog. Like, as people are drinking, did you just spy my drink? No, it's a frog.
I just have existentialism just written on the belly.
Right.
This was Camus' point with when he was readdressing the Sisyphus myth.
Yes.
Like, yes, you will have to roll the boulder up the hill every single day, but you must bring meaning to that. Like, you must make that absurdity meaningful, or else you would.
And since I haven't read that one, but I did listen to that. Since I did listen to a lecture on that entire book, now I feel like perfectly well versed in it. But like the guy's point was that the source of suffering there is actually consciousness. Like being conscious of having to do this and having the awareness that you're doing it is pointless is worse than just having to do it.
But
So that's why all the
but point
AI
of the
stories,
story-
when the AI comes to life, it's like it becomes sentient. It's really like, oh god, and it's just like suffering so much.
Well, I think that's one reason that Isaac Asimov has some really good, interesting ethics stuff that he pulls in is because I'm thinking specifically of one story in iRobot where the robot becomes sentient and then decides that humans are actually like this lower version of robots because they're weak and flesh, and but that his world is the space station he's on, and the center computer, which is what he listens to, is God. So, I don't know. It's a really interesting thing. I don't know if y'all have ever read iRobot. Have you not read iRobot?
I've seen the movie.
Oh, not the same. Not the same.
You need to, because
Yes.
you love it.
Oh,
You've got
And
to
he
read that
can too,
book.
because he would love the discussion that it
Sounds like
provides.
my short story, actually, but okay.
Well, no, yeah, it's a collection of short stories that track the sentientness of robots in a
Like an anthology.
From the beginning to
It's like an anthology of a single theme
it's the evolution of sentience
of
and
robotics.
Sounds like
Yeah.
the Netflix series Love, Death, and Robots or something like that.
Huh.
That I know.
Okay.
Question.
Start this thing.
yeah, we can stop that. We can stop that at the frog. So frog in the bottom of the beer.
That's what we're